joined us, and let's start. Pushpa, you are still muted. Yeah, now you are unmuted. So let's begin.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So welcome everybody. And it's good evening over here, this part of India, and people from New York like Adrienne, good morning. And other people, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. So the greeting goes accordingly. And it's very, very heartening to see you all again, from all over different places, different sides. Yeah, it's so nice. So welcoming all of you. And though we are experiencing different time of the day, but there are very and many common experiences that we are all going through. One of them that we were just talking is pandemic, which is also our topic. And we started with discussing how the pandemic is going on in different states of India, and similarly different parts of the globe also. So that Adrienne is joining us from New York, and she would be talking about the situation over there. And of course, Rakesh would be later on talking about the law. But the thing is that this pandemic has brought out many different facets, of democracy, legal system. Uh, I'm sorry. Is it echo only? I can hear
No,
the echo, or everybody?
I can hear it as well.
Okay, so there must be something wrong. Let me just check. Hello, is it better? Yeah? Okay, all right. So, I was just saying the situation about pandemic, which is a common experience wherever we are, whether in India, New York, Australia, UK, anywhere and everywhere. It's a common experience, though it's still different. We are experiencing it differently, and yet very, in a similar way. So this pandemic has also brought out different kind of facades, traumatic situations, memories, and past traumatic experiences individually and also collectively and socially. One part which is related to the democratic practices, Adrienne would be speaking about that. Rakesh would be speaking about another facet of it, which is related to the legal system. So we would be hearing from them a lot of things, and I wouldn't be taking much time. Just welcome you all here today. Let's stay together and hear them. I would pass on to our president, Dr. Mishra. She would be introducing Adrienne, and then Adrienne would be starting her paper. So Pushpadi, you can
Hello,
begin.
everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of our series of celebration as part of our centenary celebration. And in her introduction, our secretary has said almost everything that needs to be said more or less as an introduction. So I will simply introduce Adriana Harris, and later on I will introduce Rakesh Shukla when he starts reading his paper. I will request all the audience to keep their mic muted and at the same time write down their questions when the speaker is reading her paper. At the end of the session, namely reading session, when both the speakers have read out their papers, after that we will take up the question. That will be the interactive session, and then we will have, you can ask your question to the respective speakers. So here I introduce Adriana. Adriana Harris, PhD, is a faculty member and supervisor for the New York University postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and at the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California. She is an associate editor of Psychoanalytic Dialogues and of Studies in Gender and Sexuality. and she is on the editorial boards of Psychoanalytic Inquiry and American Imago. She publishes in the area of gender and development.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bhati and Dr. Mishra. I just first of all want to congratulate the Indian Psychoanalytic Society on this centennial. I think this is a wonderful achievement of a century of psychoanalytic work and very, very inspiring. And I'm particularly, in exactly the way that Bharti said, I am very interested to be giving this talk to an audience in India and globally, because I think we all need to be in conversation, even with all of our differences, and to discover what is common and what is distinct. I think there's some funny sounds, Bharti, I'm not sure.
Well, Adrienne, there are some people who are still joining in, so that is why. Please bear with us. Yeah.
Okay, so the title of my talk is The Pandemic Through Three Ecologies, Natural, Social, Mental, and I'll be unpacking that, that term. One of the really useful and unexpected outcomes of working remotely and lecturing on Zoom, doing these kinds of webinars, is that I found myself in conversations and collective work with audiences that are spread across the world. This is a global event, and so our conversations must be global as well. And I think that for many of us, the potential, the experience of collective work, of speaking across different systems, countries, problematics, and crises, creates really what we most deeply need, which is a collective space in which to plan, to work, and to think. So I started by being really more interested from a clinical psychoanalytic perspective on the pandemic and in the American context. But as I've worked for this past year on this topic, it's clearer and clearer to me that there is a question that undergirds this project. And I'll speak particularly about the US. Do we in the US, and you can ask whether you have the same question, do we have the political will to transform this moment? And so to preserve, or in some cases to restore, democracy. With each new turn of events, and now the violence of protest, the violence of our difference across many variables, and I speak in the United States, I think the importance of collective work and growth is more and more crucial. A subtitle to this essay now might be, and it was the title of an article in the Atlantic Monthly last year, in quotes, "The coronavirus was an emergency until Trump found out who was dying," end of quote. Though I think it is important to notice that I've just invoked Trump and I'm sort of blaming him. And that actually takes us away from the other important topic, which is what is our responsibility as citizens to effect and work for change. Now, here we are in the second year of this pandemic, and it is striking that so much has changed, and yet often it feels so ominously that nothing has changed. There's international, national, personal awareness of the pandemic, but also extraordinary challenges. When this pandemic first emerged and appeared, I think we were feeling, and we internationally were feeling, the universality of our vulnerability. Nature, the environmental mother, had turned on all of us. But actually, it is as much we who have turned on nature. And it turns out, and what's most important, is that we are not equally vulnerable. Good government is making a difference, but so is class, race, income level, economic mobility, caste, and developmental history, as I will indicate later. So I think this sets us up in an important contradiction. This pandemic is certainly an encounter with nature and environmental forces that have shocking and unmanageable power. It is deeply meaningful that this is a global event, that we are flooded with images worldwide we can all identify with, from body bags to lines of refugees, to hungry and destitute citizens, burning forests, rising seas. But the differences among us, particularly along the lines of race, class, caste, are equally striking. The notion that Mother Nature has turned on us is, of course, fantasy and real. There are elements of role reversal in this, a kind of omnipotence, but there is an important difference. I think often we take up what in psychoanalysis we think of a paranoid schizoid position, that we are being punished. And again, I'm very much hoping in our discussion that we will be able to talk about the local differences that we are all experiencing. With Tony Bass, I just did a seminar at the recent meeting of the American Psychoanalytic, and we had an analyst from Australia and one from Chile, and it was striking how extraordinarily different the circumstances were. And the Australian analyst was talking about the absolutely powerful government intervention in that country, which had utterly lowered the death rates in extraordinary ways. However, what she talked about was the impact of isolation on people's sort of psychic life. And I think that quite of isolation is actually an important psychoanalytic, psychological element for all of us to think of this. So I have called my talk Ecologies of the Mental, the Unconscious, the Social. And I also think that I'm going to be very interested to hear how you find things with patients and analysands are changing. I think the degree of isolation, the longevity of this year, I think we could think of Kubler-Ross's ideas about death and dying, about denial, about bargaining, about guilt that come, but I think particularly for patients with very deep vulnerabilities and trauma histories, I think we are seeing more and more very acute responses and difficulties in higher degrees of violence, of suicidal feelings, of really serious depression. And at the same time that there are these very serious psychological symptoms that I think we're seeing in our practice more and more acutely in this second year, there are also amazing flourishes, amazing capacities that people have found in these circumstances. There's exhaustion, there's anxiety, but there's also extraordinary creativity. And I think in that sense, we could think a pandemic, this kind of event, is also always an opportunity. And the question is how we take that up. So I have four main points that I'm going to want to unpack in detail, and I'll just introduce them now. First, I'm going to argue that this pandemic is best understood as, in the psychoanalytic concept that Laplanche and Freud and others have used, the notion of an après-coup. Après-coup is translated as afterwardsness in English, Nachträglichkeit in German. It was Freud's most nonlinear concept, the notion that something in the present activates the past, and then that past trauma comes and joins in the contemporary one. So we have a very dialectical experience of temporality. And I think that the pandemic, in terms of après-coup, has opened us to whatever early trauma we were subject to. Second point is that the particular concept, the particular moment in our development that I've been most interested in thinking about is the experience of early helplessness. So I would say that one of the après coups for all of us is that this experience of being at the mercy of extraordinary forces in nature and in the state opens us to whatever our history was with early helplessness. I mean, and we could be thinking of Winnicott and a whole variety of thinkers who were really interested in talking about how does the infant subject come to encounter another who comes to be a site of security and connection. So I think that it will trigger whatever one's early experience in particular of helplessness. And I think that is a very important part of what we notice, particularly as clinical. The third point that I think is mostly, I think, going to be in Rakesh's talk is that the whole question of how the frame has changed. And so unsettling. There's somebody, my colleague Avi Sakatapula was saying, I really miss the smell of my patients. And so the sort of dimensionality, the sort of physicality of practice has been so dramatically altered. And I think that there is both alienation and intimacy, and it's a very paradoxical circumstance. I think it's going to be quite fascinating to see as things open up, as things like levels of vaccination change, how do we go back? What changes, what doesn't? And I think all of this is sort of interesting for us to think about. The fourth point that I want us to pay attention to is something that has been very important to me in my writing and thinking over a number of decades. And that is that I'm interested in how analysts and therapists actually take care of themselves. So I'm interested in self-care, and I think that that's something for us to be very attentive to in this moment. Because I think what's curious about this current moment of practice in the pandemic is that we are actually offering protection and security and care and meaning making for our patients, but we also are living in a moment of shared vulnerability. And so I think it's interesting to think about how are we taking care of ourselves. I think one of the things that I could feel myself as an analyst, and I think is in a lot of us, is that we have a kind of omnipotence. Oh, we can take care of this other person. We can handle this clinical situation. We're very good at that, but we're not really thinking often about care of ourselves. And I want to spend a little time talking about that, and I would be interested to hear from all of you. What are the ways that you're trying to take care of yourselves? And one of the things that I have noticed in conversations about this is that I think for many of us, professional caretakers, therapists, analysts, there is a lot of shame about needing care for ourselves. And shame is a very interesting emotion and affect to think about. And I think there's some history of that I'll mention a little more. Now let me just step back from those particular things and talk about this idea of the pandemic as three ecologies: an encounter with nature, an encounter with the state, and an encounter with our own internal conscious and unconscious experience. And as I think whatever we thought at the beginning of this pandemic about what was going to happen to whom, I think that we are understanding the extraordinary differences in how it affects people. I'm going to quote the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy And in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis, he had a very interesting discussion about our reactions to the pandemic. Here's the quote: "The viral magnifying glass enlarges the characteristics of our contradictions and of our limitations. It is a reality principle that collides with the pleasure principle. Death is its companion. The contagious brutality of the virus spreads as administrative brutality." And I think we must note, in so many different cultures, this brutality is falling on our most vulnerable citizens. In the US, the control and oppression of vulnerable workers, food production, and in hospital care. In many circumstances, workers have been forced back to work, forbidden to strike or protest, at risk of losing their health benefits. It is harder to imagine how we could get closer in this country to slave labor. But I think it's also important, and I want to hear about this as well, that there are moments and opportunities for collective action and mutual support. This comes up for us in America most acutely about the question of masks and social distancing. Yes, it is part of the penetration of the state into daily life, but it's also a matter of social responsibility. And actually, in thinking about masks and social distance, I want to invoke a concept that Emmanuel Levinas has been very instrumental in speaking about, which is that masks and social distances are part of love for social citizens and responsibility. Levinas's ethics have at their core a determination that we as citizens, as persons, as individuals, have what he called an inalienable responsibility for and to the other. So I think that that is the kind of complexity and ambiguity in which I want to think about our collective and our individual tasks. Where is our freedom? Where is our responsibility? So the person who's been very influential for me in thinking about the three ecologies is the psychoanalyst Joseph Dodds, who lives both in London and in Prague. He's a long-standing psychoanalytic writer and thinker on the problems and unheeded dangers of climate change, of global warming, and the attendant dangers like pandemics that attend on these escalating phenomena. He uses nonlinear dynamic systems to sort of think about that. I'm going to just quote from his work, a recent paper in 2020, about the three ecologies. A thought can pollute an ecosystem. Ecological damage can wound minds and bodies. And ideas on climate change, such as Trump's, have burned forests in California, drowned entire islands. As Gregory Bateson put it, there is an ecology of bad ideas, just as there is an ecology of weeds. Radioactive particles, toxic pollutants, fragments of plastic, parasites, all are part of our eco-psycho-social living. We are assemblages, interesting word, of human and non-human, organic and inorganic. Fully grasp, but they grasp me, the toxic messages of political campaigning, the purr of a cat. In the three ecologies, Guattari, this is French philosophy, mapped the interconnected spaces of natural ecology, mental ecology, and social ecology. Pollution can function in all three domains. Then he goes on to quote Harold Searles, and Harold Searles is a very important American psychoanalyst from the 70s who was so far ahead of his time in terms of how he could think about the social and the interpsychic. Harold Searles in 1972 asked whether humanity is collectively reacting to the real and urgent danger from environmental pollution, much as does the psychotically depressed patient bent upon suicide by self-neglect. The collapsing biosphere becomes a means to this end and a defense against acknowledging depression, such that one feels at one with everyone else in a realistically doomed world. And he ties this to Freud's ideas of anticipatory mourning. Searles was also somebody focusing on the defensive stances of omnipotence. And I think that omnipotence, it may be also something we might think about our own project of caring for others and work. That is, this idea that we are the caretakers sits on a kind of model of omnipotence. We can help others. And what it leaves off is, how do we need also to take care of ourselves, both collectively and individually. So now I'm going to just read you briefly some statistics from the beginning of from the pandemic's sort of first hitting the US, and then in the current year. And what is very striking is that the basic inequality of who is suffering and who is dying has not really changed in this year. Disproportionately, people of color, workers, are being sacrificed to fuel the engine of a faltering economy. May 2020, US deaths were over 100,000. Now they are over 500,000. Within that group, African-American citizens are 3 times more likely than white citizens to die from COVID. Although 13% of the population, they constitute 27% of the deaths. In Black counties, they account for 60% of the deaths. There are many ways to generate statistical evidence, but the conclusion is inescapable. There are many reasons for this exposure, risky work situations, poverty. There's also a statistic that's actually investigated quite a lot in the United States, and it's called Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACE, and it tracks the kinds of long-term health vulnerabilities of children who grow up in what is being called adverse child experiences, which includes poverty, the presence of violence in the home, of drug addiction, of separation, so that what makes an adverse childhood experience is a mix, again, of the mental, the social, the economic. And this statistic, ACE, is powerfully predictive of vulnerability to COVID and also death from COVID. So now, currently, the statistics that while the highest percentage because of the total population are among white persons, ethnic and racial minority groups are still disproportionately represented among COVID-19 cases and about deaths. So this statistic that I read you in the beginning of year 1 is still actually dominates our understanding of the evidence for not merely exposure to COVID, but dying from it. So, Marty, what's our time frame? Tell me about.
You can continue, Adrienne. You can easily continue. Yeah, we have good time.
Okay, all right. So let me just hold on. Okay. So let me go back now to this idea of pandemic as an après-coup, and also the whole question of helplessness. So some of this. Okay, sorry. So as I said, I think this notion of concept of après-coup is an important aspect of trauma theory. It comes from Freud, from Lacan, from Laplanche, and others. And this idea that it is a trauma that reopens trauma, again, a non-linear form of temporality, where the present reopens the past and alters what goes forward. All the unmetabolized, all the untranslatables that all of us have had to contain and rework and keep at bay over a lifetime get triggered by an après-coup in the present that opens whatever our history is. Think about Laplanche's model in which he stresses the power of messages from others, that alterity and what the other communicates to us is absolutely crucial in the formation of our subjectivity. Messages are transmitted, translated, translations are never fully elaborated, and in the residue of enigmatic messages, the unconscious is formed and elaborated. So this is a theory really in which psychic structure is evolved intersubjectively. And in North America, I'm very much someone associated with the relational tradition, the intersubjective tradition. And I think that's the sort of place where I think I'm coming from to think about the ways in which our earliest experience of intersubjectivity subjectivity is what is triggered by the pandemic. And that means I'm thinking of these experiences as emergent, not innate. So I'm certainly wanting to turn away from a purely biological idea about drive or innateness. So our translations and reworkings of the past are always to some degree untranslated and untranslatable. And I think kind of, intromissions in Laplanche's words. So that from après-coup, I want to then turn to helplessness, because that is our earliest fundamental state, what Laplanche called the fundamental anthropological situation. None of us escape early vulnerability. What we do with it, how it becomes internalized, how it evolves, is all absolutely dependent on the intersubjective early relationship. How is attachment formed? How is helplessness managed? And how is the anxiety and terror of helplessness always only partially managed? So après-coup and early helplessness, I think, are part of how we need to understand everyone's vulnerability in a moment of a global pandemic. There could be no more extraordinary definition of helplessness than to be at the mercy of a pandemic and the complexities of governments that are and are not helping us. So just have a very brief clinical example. Somebody I see has a long history, early history of displacement, of early adoption, of being removed by the state from some parenting situations, and a lot of turmoil in foster care placements. And she has been in therapy for some time and has developed really a very sturdy, secure life. She functions as a parent, she's developing a professional competence. But she and I were both very surprised at the intensity with which the pandemic opened really deep helplessness and very ominous consequences that she feared for particularly one of her children, a child that she's most identified with. She found herself again consumed the dangers of what would fracture in the family, the displacement of her children, all the overturning of her hard-won stability and achievements. In an instance, everything could be lost. That's true in the moment. It's not that that's an inappropriate fear, but it was so resonant. It was so deeply a repetition of her history, a history that she had worked hard we had worked hard to metabolize, but which in the context of this, this pandemic really reopened very primitive early processes, unmetabolizable still for her. And I found this sort of over and over in my practice, and I'll be interested to hear you all speaking about this. And again, I think both après-coup and helplessness is really critical. So in that context, let me just say a little bit about this question of self-care. And when I have been writing about the analyst's problems with self-care, I was trying to think of it in the context of early attachment. And what I think is true in a lot of the biographies of our most esteemed figures and leaders, and in a lot of our own histories, I think that the curious and interesting commonality along many people who are caregivers, caretakers, analysts, therapists, is that they have done this job a long time. And in many cases, did this job as children of caretaking of others, sometimes a parent, sometimes a sibling. You can hear it in Lowell's biography or James McLaughlin. These are all very esteemed American psychoanalysts from the 50s and 60s. And in their own narratives, there was always a kind of caretaking function that they undertook from the beginning. Depression in a parent, anxiety in a sibling, it varied a lot. So I got interested in this idea of where does early caretaking come from and how does it emerge, and does it have perhaps something to do with many of our professional evolutions into becoming caretakers in our life's work. And one of the interesting links that I've been thinking about is that Carolyn Lyons-Ruth, who's part of the Boston Change Group and studies attachment and was involved in Dan Stern's work, has done this interesting analysis of long-term effects of disorganized attachment. And one of the features, the identifying marks of a disorganized pattern structure is that there's often role reversal, a child becoming a parent. But when you look at her research and her work and what she describes, what's very striking is that in these longitudinal studies that she's done, where she's tracked children over all of childhood, there are two kinds of patterns that children seem to use and draw on when there's a disorganized attachment circumstance. One is that the child gets disorganized and dysregulated and that it's very difficult. But the other is, she called it tend, befriend. And it is a pattern where in the disorganization in the system, the child becomes the parental figure, becomes the organizer. And this is really interesting. She wasn't connecting it to being a psychologist or a therapist, but I actually think it's interesting for us to think about, for some of us, a history of early caretaking and managing. And I think that's very interesting in terms of, does it also leave us sometimes with feelings of omnipotence? But the other thing that I think is very interesting about being the caretaker and feeling that you are the responsible one is that when you need something, often that's accompanied by shame. Not even so much guilt, but shame. And I think shame is one of our most difficult affects. So I want to sort of track that in terms of how, as we're kind of trying to be responsible and do things and take care of people, are we feeling ashamed of our own needs? Is shame a kind of lurking element in our responses to how to take care of others, but also how to take care of ourselves? I think finally, I just want to say a little bit about thinking about this question of race and class differences and how in the United States, we are slowly and with great difficulty trying to take on the question of systemic racism. There's a lot of interesting work. Robin DiAngelo's thesis on white fragility, in which a state in which, this is a quote from her, even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. And I think that's a very interesting thing to try to come to terms with. Lynn Layton, in a sort of an address at Division 39, was talking about the need to be disillusioned about white fragility and white democratic impulse, and to begin to look at systemic racism in a more honest, direct way. This is, I think, one of the crises of the pandemic that has got the incredible potential to actually push people to think in a different way, to think in a more systemic way. And the extraordinary amount of kind of repression and sort of blindness, race blindness that white people have is something that I think in the United States we are trying to take on. It's very difficult and there's enormous resistance to it. And I think if we're going to think internationally about differences, caste, class, race, I'm interested in what our difficulties, our resistances are, which I think are really considerable. And what is true and is mostly not noticed in the United States is that every moment of emergence of Black independence, whether it's the Civil War, post-Civil War, freedom of slaves, whether it's the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, or currently Black Lives Matter, every one of those moments was accompanied by a huge and violent backlash of sort of white antagonism to equality and an ending of discrimination. So what this pandemic has actually revealed is the extraordinary erasure of real movement about civil rights and equality within US, North American culture. So I think those questions really are very interesting to me. I have been writing about this in an essay that I've called The Perverse Pact, which is in American Imago. And I mean by the Perverse Pact is the self-imposed limits in regard to reflection and action that are really in white persons' consciousness and unconscious, and that inhibit our progress towards genuine civil rights. So I think to speak of the American situation, the situation in the United States and North America, is to have to notice the really recurring failure of white citizens to be able to transcend racism and actually have a genuinely egalitarian sense. This practice of how we disillusion ourselves is easier to define than to imagine how it will be developed. How do we turn the task of disillusion back upon ourselves? How do we actually contemplate and hold remorse and shame? And as I think I'm trying to suggest about shame, it is such a potent and difficult affect to handle that it's sort of, it's going to be difficult to make use of shame in a collective and genuinely transformative way. I think that you can see this in the current writing of Black thinkers. I think it's so interesting that in America, we are rereading Frantz Fanon, who was important in the 60s and then sort of disappears. His notion of the phobogenic gaze upon the Black man, the both hatred and excitement that gets entangled in racism. This is also something Sheldon George has been writing about in a book, Trauma and Race. So there's no dearth of theoretical work to be thinking about around structural and systemic racism. The question is, do we have the will? Do we have the will to really do this? I'm going to end with a quote from Dorothy Evans Holmes, who was a very important African-American analyst and witness. She describes the internal site of this denial, the layer within the psyche that contains and secrets crimes of humanity and their history. Psychoanalysis still maintains individual and institutional identifications with the silence established and promulgated by the founders of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalytic institutions maintain defenses against embracing these factors. The defenses include dissociation and projective identification. And it is difficult to work clinically with cultural trauma because of these two factors, and because most cultures continue to perpetuate and condone crimes against humanity. So just leave you at the end with a series of questions. Think of Judy Butler's work. What makes a grievable life? Whose lives are we continuing not to see as grievable? Levinas's notion was, what is our responsibility for each other? And I guess my question, do we have the will collectively, individually? Are we trapped in white fragility? Do we have the will to change? Slavoj Žižek published a very readable book on the pandemic, and along with a number of the people I've been quoting, he sees the danger in the following way. Are we heading for a new barbarism? What would need to be in place such that we could trust people and ourselves to practice collective fragility, collective safety? Okay, I think I will stop and thank you very much for inviting me to this celebration of your centennial. I feel like as I'm listening to myself talking, I think this is a grim paper, but this is a grim time. So I apologize for grimness, but not exactly apologize. I also want to stand behind it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you very much. I now call Rakesh Shukla. I now call Rakesh Shukla. Introduce Rakesh Shukla. Rakesh has more than 3 decades of deep engagement with law, constitutional jurisprudence, human rights, and justice, melded with training and practice in psychodynamic psychotherapy. Explorations in the interface of law and psychoanalysis are a major area of engagement. Interventions in training of judges to minimize impact of unconscious biases, prejudices, and stereotypes in judicial decision-making constitute an important area of work. Rakesh has designed and conducted courses on law and psychology at the National Law University, Odisha. His writings have been published in major newspapers as well as journals on law and psychology, including the International Journal of Applied Psychoanalytical Studies. Apart from contributing chapters in books like Quest for Justice, Psychoanalytic Explorations with Judges in book Law, Psychoanalysis and Society, which has been published by Routledge, he has written 7 books, including monographs on various topics of law. He is a regular contributor on websites, journals, and newspapers. Among many other professional bodies, he is a member of Supreme Court Bar Association and International Council of Jurists. Over to you, Rakesh. We are waiting to hear your paper.
Thank you, ma'am. So I would like to use a PowerPoint So I'm just clicking on the share screen. So thank you for this opportunity, and I will start with 2 points which Adrienne also touched upon. So in this webinar, as part of the Centenary celebrations on pandemic, democracy and law, I will be presenting on COVID control and rule of law, the role of the unconscious and irrational. Now, what is rule of law? Rule of law is actually based on this French phrase, which essentially means principle of legality, which in turn means that government based on principles of law. And these are old phrases, so it says principles of law, not of men, but in some ways representative. The other aspects would be equality, justice, rights, common good, accountability, independence of judiciary, presumption of innocence. These are some of the ingredients of rule of law, which is not a static concept. As laws are developing, rights are expanding. So we will see how these aspects of rule of law were impacted. Now, this pandemic is a public health emergency. And it's a reasonable expectation of citizens that resources of the government would be towards mitigation. Now, what we see, we will look at the changes in law brought about in 3 areas: industrial law, agriculture, citizenship, and equality. Now, arbitrariness is antithetical to equality. So we will see this pandemic, what effect it had. As Adrienne mentioned about inequality, that it has not changed, she said, and that African Americans there in US were 3 times more likely to die. Similarly, about, I think, the percentage of population, 27%, she said, and I think maybe 13%. Now we will begin from the pandemic itself, how it affected it. In India, this was the strictest lockdown in the whole world. 4 hours notice was given. Public transport was cancelled. Migrant workers were stuck. There was no work, no money, no savings. Now we see the differential impact from the start of the pandemic itself. Those injured feet we will see represent the trek home by workers. Then we look at we will come back to it, but when we look at legal system, what did it result in? Virtual hearing. And how did that impact? The government issued a notification that wages for lockdown are to be paid. And I, on behalf of 5 unions, also appeared. This was challenged by the employers. The owners, the management challenged it. And in the virtual hearing, there is a control room which can mute you. So it gave, it sort of accentuated the control. Like if I am appearing physically in a court of law, then I can speak. But with this virtual hearing, what it resulted in is that in this hearing, it gives more space, for example, of giving more time to the management, the employer's lawyers, and the workers' lawyers can be muted. So in fact, it gives greater control. As you proceed, we'll see that in a way, things got accentuated by this lockdown. And as a result, the Supreme Court stayed the notification and said employees, workers can negotiate. But once you stay the mandatory nature of this notification, there was no negotiation by employers. And so they were not, most of the cases, the employers refused to negotiate. So that was as far as the virtual hearing is concerned, that in fact it gave greater control. And it gave greater space for play of whatever may be the biases and we'll come to that later. It is not to value judge people's biases, but that all of us are prey to it. And what are the ground realities? Industry, even when industrial estates and areas are planned here, there is no accommodation for workers actually. And so workers stay in slums around factories or extremely unsafe multi-story structures which have been erected by landlords in a hurry. Now these are one-room tenements. They lack civil amenities. Like the wages for lockdown, there was a notification saying there has to be no eviction for non-payment of rent. But again, there is a difference in practice. And so the landlords did evict people who could not pay the rent. Now in these, there is lack of civic amenities, water shortage. So all these things about social distancing, washing hands, sanitizing, these were impossible. Also, these are migrant workers. They had no social security. So began, and since all public transport was cancelled, so in desperation, people started walking home. So these are a few visuals, whether it's of carrying older people, children. And we see the scale of migration. So to many, it was reminiscent of partition and the scale, which was one of the largest migrations in 1947. And now we see what was its impact on law. Now in industrial law, we have minimum wages, which is based on food, clothing, rent, education for a family of 4, to have a stable industrial working class. Then we have laws like the Industrial Employment Standing Order Act, which defines work time, wages, wage rates. Payment of wages. And we had the contract laws like the Contract Labor Regulation. If permanent, the worker should be permanent. Now was in fact very opportunistic. to push an agenda. There were 29 laws which were repealed, including these have been crucial: Industrial Disputes Act, Trade Union Act, Factories Act, Interstate Migrant Worker Act, Employees Compensation, Employee State Insurance. We got 4 laws. As you see, they all came during the pandemic. Industrial Code 2020, Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code 2020, Code of Social. Deep of these laws. How do we see law? Law is to actually has a role to play in mediating and balancing interests. Now here there were 2 things: ease of doing business for employers and protection to workers and employees. What all these laws did was to promote a hire and fire regime, to in fact create a permanent cadre of insecure and temporary employees. It took away the right to protest from workers. It allowed easy retrenchment. And the provisions which were in favor of workers and employees earlier were applicable to any concern or establishment employing 100 workers. This was changed to 300, with the result that 90% of the establishment were out of ambit of the provisions which protected the rights of workers. Then we look at agricultural laws. Now, agriculture is a state subject. However, these were central laws. These were bulldozed through the. There was no consultation with states or with parliament. Generally, you have a procedure of referring laws to a select committee of parliament. These were just bulldozed through because of the brute majority of the present ruling dispensation. Also, for long, we have had this agricultural produce marketing committees with a minimum support price. Now, what these laws do is to push big agro-business, which would control the market, depress farm gate prices, buy infrastructure, raise costs, and eat up the small farms, which has happened in the US. I'm informed. Like it is like from seeds to retail stores, what they call from farm to fork. And the meat processing companies, they would own the livestock. They would raise the animal. The farmers would just be raising the animals on contract. So this is the major thrust which the pandemic was used to push. And as especially people in India know that this protest has been going on now for 3-4 months of farmers against these laws. So what did pandemic do? As you saw, the title of this is Pandemic Control, Centralization. One is the Disaster Management Act, under which a refusal to comply with the direction of the central government is punishable. So it equated the central government with national interest. And actually law and order, agriculture, these are all state subjects. In India, we have under the constitution 3 lists. So the state list is areas about which only the state can make laws. The union list is about which the central government can make laws. And there is a concurrent list in which both the state and the center can make laws. So it affected federalism to a great extent. And the major thrust which it did was to push this agenda of one nation, one leader, one nation, one language, one nation, one flag, one nation, one religion, one nation, one food. So a whole lot of laws regarding food and cattle slaughter were also brought in. Then we look at the impact on rights, on life and liberty, freedom of speech and expression, freedom to assemble peaceably, dissent, how the laws on sedition, the anti-terror laws, how did they work? So there were arrests and detentions across the board of comedians, climate change activists, civil liberties activists, journalists. The law has been really impacted, and the rule of law has been majorly impacted in terms of all these rights. Discriminatory laws were brought in. We will go a little later into it about love jihad, citizenship laws, National Register of Citizenship, Citizenship Amendment Act. These have all been brought in, and how the protests against them also got affected as far as the right to assemble peaceably is concerned. Then we look at the role of the judiciary. Now, the role of the judiciary is to check on arbitrary exercise by the executive. And actually, tension between the judiciary and executive is not bad. It is good for democracy. But this pandemic, the judiciary seems to have gone along by and large and put a stamp on detentions, denied bail or given bail after long periods of imprisonment, even when there was no prima facie material which was produced. And in India, the process is punishment. So as an under trial, which goes with it, under trial means there is no evidence presented at this stage and you are presumed innocent. But however, the detention is detention. In law, theoretically okay, it's presumption of innocence, but the process is the punishment. Now, what I wish to focus, as Adrienne also said, that this basic inequality, that has not changed. Now, what happened here as we segue from the pandemic to the normal? Now, these fault lines are already there in the legal system. So it is not that the pandemic created certain things. These are already there, these fault lines, they just got accentuated. Like we see about inequality. If inequality is growing, what did the pandemic do? In India in 2020, there are 55 billionaires. One each week. Now this is a trend all over the world. In the world, there are 3 billionaires every 2 days. So when we see the differential impact of the pandemic, that on the one hand, there is no money, no savings, and still people preferred to go back to their villages because in the city there was no social security. And when I say that the fault lines are there, we will look at the judicial function. Now, impartiality is crucial to the judicial function. It has an impact on society. It has an impact on the individuals whose cases are being tried. It has an effect on the constitutionality of laws, especially where they involve rights and liberty. This is all pre-pandemic. All these laws, their constitutionality has nothing to do with the pandemic. But they point out to the fault lines present and the playing out of those fault lines. And also the subjective at play, which at times we can see when one court gives conviction, the other gives acquittal. And evidence in law, remains the same. It's the same evidence. And it becomes particularly sharp when the difference is between death penalty by a court and acquittal. Now we will see that actually all of us are prey to biases, prejudices, and stereotypes. Like you have this osmosis-like process almost. of whichever community, religion, gender, caste we grow up in, we seem to imbibe that. So it is not to apportion blame on anyone. And we see that this works in the legal system throughout. From the drafting of the law, when the law is made, to the working of the law, when it is implemented, to the court proceeding, to the court, to the judgment. And how it impacts all these extremely sound principles of law and jurisprudence: presumption of innocence, burden of proof, evaluation of evidence. And the areas of play are often class, caste, religion, gender, sexual orientation. So these are all the dramatis personae, the drafting person, the implementer, the investigator, the prosecutor, the judge, the lawyer, the mediator. So all, it is in play at each stage in the legal system. Now, when I say that what the pandemic did and that the fault lines were there from before, now what do we see? This is during the pandemic. So what is it shown here? That a suicide bomber who now has coronavirus trapped. And when I say that these fault lines existed from before, now I have been doing workshops for the past about 8 years at least with judges. Actually, I was struck when Adrienne was saying about racism and what to tackle. And as one of the positives I can tell you, I have talked to colleagues in US and they were really struck that there has been space in India to have this kind of intervention officially in judicial academies to address this question. So this picture has nothing to do with the pandemic. The method I use is I project images, and as a facilitator, my job is first to check thought and say, okay, what is the feelings it is evoking in the participants who are judges? So as you can see, suspicion, anger, these are some of the things. Terrorized, orthodoxy, aggression, fear, and associations. Needs to be put behind bars. Thank God he's not staring at me. Correlating with our own individual anxieties. Hardcore, threatening, orthodox, desperate, Osama bin Laden. Terror will he create? And we see in the pandemic, what was it? Super spreader, as we saw in this picture here. Super spreader, Corona Jihad, Tablighi villains, as some of, especially people outside India may not know, that there was a meeting going on here of the Tablighi Jamaat, which is actually an organization to reform Islam. It has nothing to do with conversion. It is about reforming within the religion. Jamaat attack, Corona distributors, embracing Corona. And they use a lot of mythological figures of Ramander and, people embracing him. And so again, I said these fault lines were there from before. Now we are looking at 1998, So Amir Khan was 18 just then. He was picked up. And he was for 14 years in jail. And he was acquitted out of 17 out of 19 cases. When I say what process is punishment, so he spent 14 years in jail. Actually, in the course which I do, I managed to get all the material, the charge sheet, the FIR, and the evidence against him, which I use for this course on law and psychology. So you see, these fault lines were there from before. that there was no material. Once he was picked up, that process was punishment. Then and psychoanalysis has always been paradoxical. So one is this, these feelings which come into play and get mobilized. And the second is, this is one of the images which I use, almost one of the first images. And it is a total sort of mystery to judges. When I ask them, that they wonder why they're being asked. First of all, the judicial function is of logic and rationality. That why they should get in touch with their feelings of what this image evokes. So, and when we see now, when I say about one nation, one religion, that in the legal system also, how now we see what are the feelings evoked by the image of the mother: care, affection, comfort, respect, obedience, pride, sacrifice, kindness, compassion, the associations, mother is best, great security, goddess, guiding light, food, most lovable, sacrifice, most you get. So, I mean, these were the feelings and associations evoked. So what it also does is mobilize our positive feelings. Now, what happens? When an individual is before a judge, I might be the judge, and the person in my mind may be fitting the very stereotype of what of a terrorist. And it is evoking certain feelings in me. So they color me. Similarly, the feelings for my mother, for motherland, they are getting mobilized. Now, this is not only in individual cases. When I say that impacts society, so I have been part of challenging the constitutionality for example, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now, these are at play in the individuals who are adorning the bench at that time, the judges who are there. Now, when the judgment comes, it is all about rationality, rights, reasonable restrictions. Now, these in India, as yet, we have no recordings of the court proceedings, even of the Supreme Court. So many times we don't have access to the free association of judges. But many times the observations made, the expressions of the judges, it is rare to find it, because this will not be written in the judgment. So now, I mean, this is the only instance I know of, and it is in a way like QED, as they say, that the thing stands established. Now, this is actually a judgment. Kanhaiya Kumar was the president of Jawaharlal Nehru Students' University, which is a university which has been like, okay, like leftism and activism. And this was a case of sedition, but this is in a bail judgment, which had nothing to do with anything else. It was just about bail is only to be denied if you are going to run away or if you're going to influence witnesses. It is not any kind of trial. And you see, this is an excerpt from the judgment. They are in the safe environment because our forces are there at the battlefield, situated at the highest altitude of the world, where even the oxygen is so scarce that those who are shouting anti-national slogans, holding posters of Afzal Guru and Maqbool Bhatt close to their chest, honoring their martyrdom, may not be able to withstand those conditions for an hour even. This is an excerpt from the same judgment. Whenever some infection is spread in a limb, effort is made to cure the same by giving antibiotics orally. And if that does not work, by following second line of treatment. Sometimes it may require surgical intervention also. However, if the infection results in infecting the limb to the extent that it becomes gangrene, amputation is the only treatment. So in India, because of partition, there is great amount of anxiety about fragmentation, about the motherland being broken again. So all these fault lines were there. This case is from before the pandemic. Coming to the pandemic, this is the picture of the Kisan Andolan 2021 against the 3 central laws which were brought. Again, this is again a picture with this hammer and sickle. These are thousands of farmers who've been protesting for, I think, about 3.5 months now at the borders of Delhi. And when I say it accentuated, this is a picture of workers' protest. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. This is again a picture which I use in these workshops with judges. Similarly, I use the Maoist Naxalites. What are the feelings evoked? These are Maoist Naxalites represent the, what are they called? Extreme left here in India. So the feelings evoked was terror, fear, anger, hatred, repulsion, injustice, revolt, associations of bombing, injustice, terrorism, extremists, anarchy, bloodshed, AK-47. There were some associations of rehabilitated, they are misguided. And now when we see what are the factors at play here, love for mother and motherland, anxiety of partition and dismemberment, the images of inimical attacking terrorists, and of the brave son protecting mother and motherland. All the anti-terror laws like Prevention of Terrorism Act, Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Act, and now we have the Unlawful Prevention Activities Act. All these have been upheld by courts in India, by the Supreme Court of India. None of the laws have been struck down as unconstitutional in the context of fundamental rights. When we look at the picture now here, when I say pictures of the Kisan Andolan, so it evoked a lot of anxiety about partition, separatist movement. There are a large number of Sikhs in it. So separatist movement, they will again cause a partition. When we see the workers' protest, and as we see, this has been used to great effect, this anxiety. From the top, every dissent has been treated as this has been coined by the present leader of this dispensation, Tukde gang. Means anybody who is for these is a gang which wants to make little pieces out of the motherland. But as I said, these fault lines were there from before. When we see that picture of the workers' protest, what are the anxieties in the individuals who are in judges? All of us are prey to our own class biases, of anarchy, of bloodshed. And so what happens? How does it play out? You know, right to protest. This is a fundamental right in India, right to protest peaceably. So this is from pre-pandemic. In all the cases, you will find that the management manages to get a stay, an injunction against protests. And the okay, you must protest at some great distance from there, which is not going to really impact anything. So it impacts the everyday working of the law. When we see evidence evaluation, what is evidence evaluation? I myself do labor cases. So on one hand, there will be a evidence of, say, a personnel manager. On the other hand, there will be evidence of 10 workers. And we will find that the judgment relies on the evidence of one person, the personnel manager. Or what constitutes misconduct, what is proportionate punishment. So we see it at play in the legal system. And what we find, what was the impact of the pandemic. So all of you are familiar. People from north of India may have also heard that Disha Ravi. She was a climate change activist. She was arrested for sedition. And much was made of this toolkit, which was just a thing of how to mobilize to support farm protests. Then we have comedians who were detained. This was even before the show had started, on suspicion that he's going to crack some joke which will harm religious sentiments. But as I said, these fault lines are there from before. Dr. Binayak Sen, he was arrested in 2007. He has done exemplary work for workers. These were doctors who went to workers' towns and there started a workers' hospital. It is known as Shaheed Hospital. It is still there in Chhattisgarh. He was arrested in 2007. So as I said, these fault lines have been there from before. And he was convicted of sedition in 2010. And in all this plays a huge role. The fears of an anxiety, of partition, of sedition, and when we see the right to protest. So that right to protest we can see in a pre-pandemic and in, so to say, the normal functioning of the legal system, in evidence evaluation. And now what happened in the pandemic? For the first time, this discriminatory law was brought in, Citizenship Amendment Act, which would give citizenship to Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and leave out Muslims. So there was huge protest going on. Now that got broken up. It had been going on for months. That got broken up as a result of this pandemic, although they were trying to have keep social distancing even during the protest. Now, not only these laws like anti-terror laws, liberty, we see even, I use this image also. And what do we find? When I say that these fault lines are there from before. Now, sex among consenting adults is an offense under the Indian Penal Code made in 1860. Now, 2009, the Delhi High Court decriminalized it. 2013, the Supreme Court criminalized it. 2018, again, the Supreme Court decriminalized it. So what happens? For 5 long years, thousands of people again became criminals and prey to police harassment, extortion. Now, nothing changes as far as the outer is concerned. That unless there is a process of addressing these fault lines, suppose I am a judge. At present, there is no intervention in the judicial training of this nature. And that my feeling may be of disgust, at most, maybe it evokes disgust in me. And as we often know, that a disgust may often find behind it attraction. One doesn't know. But the impact, when I'm saying not of individual lives, but of societal level at a very large scale, that thousands of people become criminals for 5 long years again. Now, when we look at this picture, we have all these laws: presumption of innocence, burden of proof on prosecution, evidence evaluation. Now, what happens? I am a judge. My feeling is, this guy is a smack addict. He must have committed the theft. And this colors the application. So all these legal principles in law, of course, They are very sound, but in practice, this is how they may work. That they affect everything. When I said about evidence evaluation, all these evidence evaluation is done by individuals. So when we look, say, at the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case, 26 people were given death penalty. 19 were acquitted. At that time, the High Court was abolished. So the trial court gave death penalty. Now, the evidence always remains the same. It is one thing to differ from death penalty to life punishment should be given, but quite another on the same evidence for 19 people to be acquitted who were given death penalty. Now, obviously, there are individual subjective factors at play. And how is that in consonance with any sense of fair play or justice? Similarly, about the caste system, this has been one of the most difficult areas to tackle. This represents the origins of the caste system, where the Shudras are from the feet, Vaishyas, Kshatris from the arms, and Brahmins from the head. Now, these are judicial decisions which we find. Bhauri Devi was a Sathin. She was a part of a women's project working against child marriage in Rajasthan. And she was gang raped. Now, this is from a judgment. Since the accused are upper caste men, the rape could not have taken place because Bhauri was from a lower caste. Then we find, particularly, these are Protection of Civil Rights Act, which is earlier called Untouchability Offences Act. So these were judges who were trying their best. They were well aware they are trying anti-discriminatory cases. So rationally and logically, they are trying their best not to be let their own prejudices in. Now, this is an excerpt from a judgment. Now, which makes it an offense. Now, what is the judgment? Calling a chamar a chamar. Chamar is people who work with leather. Maybe insulting him, but it would not be an insult on the ground of untouchability. So you see how even in the written judgments, at times it gets reflected. So it is, caste resides very close in India to the surface. Now, here we are not talking that, oh, caste is in villages, not in town. This is a person who retires the Inspector General of Registration, a very high post. When he retired, the officials sprayed cow dung on his office, furniture, threshold, official vehicle. So it is very much prevalent, and these operate in the legal system. Then we look at judicial actions. So there was the Ramander Babari Masjid dispute. Actually, when Adrienne was talking about this April coup and activating past trauma, I was wondering about collective past trauma. So one was that in this dispute which had been there, the Supreme Court of India decided that the Babari Masjid was illegally demolished. It was a violation of law, violation of undertaking given to the court. However, it handed over the whole area to make a temple for Ram. Now, this was started by Mr. Advani at that time, who was the leader of opposition, from Somnath. This temple was destroyed by Muhammad Ghazni in 1025. We will see how this works out when the judiciary steps in a way which looks to be in tandem. So he started this past collective trauma, which gets evoked. This is like a formula, this evoking of past trauma, as if it had happened yesterday. So he started this yatra, Rath Yatra. All these are deeply touching emotional chords. Rath Yatra, like a chariot of Ram. And it culminated in the destruction on 6th December 1992 of the Babri Masjid. Then now in the pandemic, these are all laws which have come in the pandemic. The love jihad laws. we'll come to what love jihad is. Already these laws have been brought in 3 states, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and they are next to be brought in Karnataka and Haryana, 2 other states. And it results in the detention of adult interfaith couples who marry. But as I said, these fault lines are there from before. There may be sections who advocate this, but we see when the judicial stamp is put on this, when the courts take cognizance of that matter. So we see this is a PIL, a public interest litigation, in which what happened when this agitation for making the Ramander was going on, it was fairly clear that that is just one issue. It is a device. So this Places of Worship Act 1991 was brought in, under which the places of worship as they stood on August 15, 1947, that status quo was meant to be maintained. Only in the case of Babari Masjid, that was to be the only exception, so that this issue doesn't get raked up. This is now a notice issued on 12th March 2021, totally current. What do we find? This public interest says that August 15, 1947 is an arbitrary date. If a date is to be fixed, it should be 11,092. That should be the cut of the date, as places of worship existed on 1192, when Muhammad Ghori defeated Prithviraj Chauhan. And on this, the Supreme Court of India has issued notice. Now, this is like a formula, when I said. In Serbia, it was the Battle of Kosovo, 1389. So what happens? You evoke, activate a past trauma, as if it happened yesterday. Conflate. In Serbia, what was done? Battle of Kosovo, in which the Serbians got defeated, was by Ottoman Turks. So there you conflate the Ottoman Turks with today's Bosnian Muslims. And here what you do, that the Mongol who attacked India, they are to be conflated with the present day Indian Muslims. And what we see when I say that the fault lines were there, and that when the judicial stamp was put in it. Now the court has chosen to issue notice, thus reopening a Pandora's box. So when we see about the rule of law, how the legal system is functioning, and we will see how, when I say when we segue to the normal, we see the love jihad laws. Love jihad is Muslim terrorist, Hindu woman. So they make her fall in love with her, convert her, and so that she becomes a terrorist. That in short is a theory which is floated and which seems to have little factual basis, but 3 laws have already been brought in. People are being detained under this. Now what do we find? These love jihad laws have been brought in today. The Kerala High Court in 2009 directed the Director General of Police, who is the highest official in a state, about a movement called Love Jihad, to find out the organization involved in such activities, where does the money come from, school and college students and youngsters converted into Islam during the last 3 years, is it an all India movement, has it got financial support, and the last, is there any connection between Love Jihad movement, counterfeiting, smuggling, drug trafficking and terrorist activities. So when there is a judicial stamp, that lends it a certain validity. So these fault lines have been there in the legal system, which have got accentuated because of the pandemic. Now this is 2011. That is a decade back. Graham Staines and his two minor sons, who were aged 10 and 6, they were burned to death while they were sleeping in a station wagon in 1999. And we find a Supreme Court judgment. Though Graham Staines and his two minor sons were burned to death while they were sleeping in a station wagon at so-and-so place, this is in Orissa, the intention was to teach a lesson to Graham Staines about his religious activities, namely converting poor tribals to Christianity. I'll just be finishing. Sorry, I think I'm taking too much time.
Yes,
I'll
please.
just be finishing. So now we find even an interpretation of statutes. This Rajasthan Sati Prevention Act was brought in 1987 when Roop Kanwar, a young woman, was burnt on the pyre. Now you see the legal definition. Legal definition under the act means the burning or burying alive of any widow, along with the body of her deceased husband, irrespective of whether such burning or burying is voluntary on the part of the widow or otherwise. And this is an excerpt from the judgment.
Rakesh, you need to finish now, Rakesh.
Okay, I'll just finish. Another 2-3 minutes. So the judgment says Sati means a woman being virtuous, having strong character, completely devoted towards her husband, and having a relationship with only one man during her whole life. So we see how this plays out. We will skip this, but these are illustrations of how gender comes into play. We can change the law, but how the prejudices and biases, whether about the moral or immoral character, comes into play. I will be ending now, though. This is a quote from a review of a book written by Jerome Frank called Courts on Trial, Myths and Realities in American Justice. The virile chapter on the cult of the robe shows what Judge Frank is after, namely to have an intelligent public understand that the springs of decision in judges do not differ from the springs of decision in other men. The wearing of the robe and legal jargon tends to becloud that fact. Now I will be ending here. The appeal in law can only be on legal grounds. To allege bias of a judge is contempt. The only way is to take on board the biases and prejudices, to process the feelings evoked and exercise choice. Self-correction is the only course. And I will end with this last slide. This is a judgment of 18 March, in which the Supreme Court has said to avoid misogynistic comments. As an example of self-correction, it is like ending on a positive note. The Supreme Court has given directives: desist from expressing opinions that women are physically weak, need protection, incapable of or cannot take decisions. Men are head of the household and take all decisions. Women should be submissive and obedient. Good women are sexually chaste. And as one more direction was, I had tried but not yet successful on having balanced groups of judges, which would give them an opportunity to reflect on work, outlet and space for processing anxieties, fears and frustrations generated by work, increase self-awareness and capacity to self-reflect. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rakesh. Yeah. Okay, will you please...
I think I overshot the time.
Will you please turn off your share screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, both the papers are open for discussion. I thank Rakesh for presenting this very long paper. Anyway, he has cited many instances, and it is for the audience to ask questions and to judge. And I also now open Adrienne Harris's paper for discussion. The audience are requested to place their questions to Adrienne and to Rakesh. Louise, I saw you scribbling fiercely, a lot of notes. Would you like to ask any questions? Okay, Adrienne?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I speak? Can I ask a question? Can I make a comment or?
Sure, Adrienne, sure.
I thought that one of the points that Rakesh was making was very important, to not just be talking about individual trauma, but also collective trauma. And it made me think a lot about, the whole notion of intergenerational transmission of trauma, of how these traumatic events and these historic events, in fact, live in our bodies and minds and psyches. And I think to think of collective trauma as well as individual trauma is a very important point.
Yes.
Also, if I may add, I have been thinking of what can be healthy mourning as far as collective trauma is concerned. That when that doesn't take place, there may always be people who might want to, in a way, encash these feelings. That what could be possible ways of healthy mourning?
Yeah, it's a
At a
really
collective
important
level.
question.
Adrienne Ponzoni, you wanted to ask a question?
You'll have
hello
to
to-
unmute you. Yeah.
Yes, I just done it. Well, I would like to make just a comment, and is to thank the IPS for this organizing this conference of today, of this interchange, and to thank especially Adrienne Harris and Rakesh. I both met Rakesh in New Delhi in 2018 when I came on that site visit to India, and then we had the pleasure of having Adrienne Harris in Uruguay in a conference in August 2018 that it was about helplessness. And I found that very interesting. I mean, just two things about the two papers. The subjects you bring, Adrienne, about the après-coup, or the resignification, as we call it, helplessness, setting, and how analysts care about themselves. I found that, I mean, there's so many things to say about your paper and about Rakesh that is difficult with, I don't know how much time we have and for discussion. But I think there is a common point in the two papers about, you have both stressed the vulnerability and precariousness and fragility that I think is not only individual, but collective. I mean, with this pandemic, we're all going through the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. And this is something that this pandemic has shown us, that we all are going through this hell storm in different embarkations. And there are people who are well situated or better situated, and people who are really badly situated. As you show, Rakesh, it's not the same to walk with shoes that without shoes. And it depends a lot where you have to walk. And I think psychoanalysis, and I think this concept of helplessness is very, very important. It stresses the human fragility or vulnerability. And I think as psychoanalysts, we have to be in the social arena, as we say, in the social space, to show that, well, this pandemic has shown once again, it was there, but I mean, it's now more striking, and it's like a slam in our face of the vulnerability of the health systems and of the judicial system, of the law system. Yeah. And it's something that we need to be there as a voice of how to, because we work individually and also we work collectively in groups, to how to face and deal with this fragility or precariousness. I mean, I just seen this film, Indian film called, and it's in Netflix, The White Tiger. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And it's very, I mean, it's like many of your slides, Rakesh, that it's breathtaking. And how are we going to deal with injustice and suffering and this inequality growing even more, every time? I think there is hope, and I think there's the possibility of, and we have a tool there of, and I read, there is this, so many people that I think we can read besides our colleagues, psychoanalysts, that are writing a lot, but I find a lot of help in reading some philosophers. We have this, well, Chul Han, the Korean philosopher, who has wrote a lot lately, and others. And there is this lady, this Spanish philosopher called Adela Cortina, and she has talked about, she calls, and I finish here, with this cosmopolitan hospitality. And I think this is something Yuval Noah Harari as well, the Israeli who has written from gods to, no, from animals to gods and many other books, that we have either, we go through the path of solidarity and global solidarity, or towards the path of division. And this is always like a social and individual fight. And it's the hill we have to climb. And I congratulate here Amanda Gorman's poem on the hill we climb. It's always about the hill we have to climb. Thank you very much. A lot to say. It's too short now, the time.
Diana, would you like to respond?
Just to say thank you for bringing this sort of determination that we are faced with a task, and do we have the courage, the fortitude, the determination to take up collective change? I think, and you're describing it at a global level. I think it's going to be hard at every level, at the sort of institutional level, at the national level. And, I think it's very, it's sort of interesting we're talking about having to do it. I guess I'd be interested in thinking, do we feel optimistic or not at this moment? And is this a moment that we're going to be able to capitalize on? I mean, one of the dangers is that we all, eventually things open up, we have herd immunity, and we go back and nothing changes systemically. And that's our question, I think. What is the collective and individual will to work for change? And I think it's uncertain in America, I would say. I can't speak anywhere for anyone else.
May I add a comment?
Yeah.
Like in the trauma, I was thinking of helplessness, And I mean, the helplessness in a way, and the desperation to start walking home for thousands of people. The desperation which may have been felt, I don't know what their desperation might be, of connecting it with anxiety of death, or, I mean, to me, it was indicating a kind of desperateness to undertake a journey, which is foolhardy in a way. And a lot of price was paid. It wasn't, there were all sorts of, India in a way was partitioned. So there were interstate restrictions. So at places they were lathi charge, they had to hide and go. But the whole desperation and helplessness, which might have been experienced at a collective level also.
Any other questions? Any other questions or comments? Anyone from
Yes, Zareen.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bharti.
Zareen wants to ask something or say something.
Okay, Zareen.
You'll have to unmute.
This is just a comment really on what Rakesh was saying. While on the one hand, we are talking about this very, in the pandemic, this very precarious state that we're all in, the fragility, the vulnerability, the fear of life, the fear of, all the freedoms taken away, etc. Rakesh's presentation was how well, the powers that be, whether it's the judiciary, the state, the central, was amassing power. I mean, to me, I couldn't help the contrast. We're talking about the extreme state of, fragility and vulnerability. But your presentation was showing us how, during this time, though you say the fault lines were there, but these tendencies, power, control, was control being used as a kind of, I don't know, antidote to vulnerability, or was there some exploitation of vulnerability? I mean, I couldn't help seeing these two forces, one pitted against the other.
Thank you. Rakesh, do you want to respond?
This is just a comment, and I mean, it's sort of in a it sort of feeds into the presentation.
Okay. Any other questions or any other comments?
Can I just say that I think that Rakesh's point about the fault lines being present and then getting activated really is a very important and good description of the American situation, and that the fault lines around class and around race are just, they go back and back and back. And I think it just, something that was brewing and potent just really jumped in the most intense way. I think the statistics around COVID deaths are they are absolutely irrefutable. And they, as Rakesh says, they have an old fault line. So.
Any other questions? Okay.
I just wanted to add this, that we have to address these fault lines. Otherwise, in the middle of a pandemic, it's like digging a well when the fire has started.
Yeah, that's right. I agree.
Okay, if there are no other questions, then it's my pleasant duty to sum up what has been said till now. Actually, Adrienne Harris addressed in her paper 3 ecological sceneries, one natural, the other psychological, and the third one was social. So she talked about the climate change, the relationship between human and non-human, organic and non-organic, and how we human beings actually have treated our nature. Are we really thinking anything about it? There is a very direct connection between pandemic and the way human beings have treated the nature. So she has raised this question, whether we are doing collectively or thinking collectively about doing something to stem this climate crisis, the crisis of global warming. When she talks about psychological ecology, she's talking about something which is, with which I think all practicing psychoanalysts are familiar. Like when she says that one of her colleagues said that I miss the smell of my patients. Actually, something similar, all of us actually have experienced. We have missed the physical presence of our patients. And it is the smell of the patient, it is just physical presence of the patient, the way they talk, and the feeling of warmth and the feeling of hatred and the feeling, all the presence of the feeling itself is totally absent in virtual analysis or in whatever online practice that we are doing. The important point that she has addressed is that in taking care of our patients also, most psychoanalysts totally forget to take care of themselves. And there is a question of denial. She has brought up the question of child parent. And it is evidentially established that most psychotherapists actually were child parents in their childhood. And so what she has said actually is evidentially established. And so they think that they have to take care of their patients, of other people. And in this, they actually deny self-care. So she has talked about the trauma about when we come to pandemic and social situation, she has talked about the trauma. The most important point actually in pandemic had been, to my experience, the helplessness that people actually have felt. The uncertainty, the unpredictability, and the helplessness she has emphasized. And when she says that the present trauma actually opens up or reopens the past trauma, both collectively and individually. So that is something that we need to address. So these three aspects of pandemic, they need to be discussed. They need to be addressed, because each of them have opened up a lot of division and a lot of gap in our democratic system. She has largely talked about from American perspective. When she comes to this, she actually talks about the racism which is raising its head, which is related probably to the insecurity that we have actually felt probably pretty early in our life. And she has then talked about how we can address all these factors in a systemic way. It is not that we have to address it in a particular situation, but there must be something wrong in the social system itself. And in order to address that social system, we also need to go deeper into the psychic mechanism of human beings. Unless we can do that, the system actually cannot be addressed. So that is the most important thing that we need to think about. Rakesh in his paper has pointed out how the government actually during pandemic situation has appealed to certain pre-existing anxieties, fears, and used it to its own advantage. It has also reopened trauma, mostly collective trauma. Partition, for example, in India was an extremely traumatic event, and therefore to use this fear of partition, the fear of the country being divided again, that is used by the government in order to achieve its ends. That was one thing. Similarly, positive feelings also are used, namely mother and motherland. And mother and motherland, the positive feelings that you love your mother and therefore you cannot allow it to be disintegrated, etc., are also being used, which are to the detriment of democracy and which actually give rise to greater and greater control. Though he has pointed out that all the fault lines were there already, but it has probably become more, it has been actually used in a much more intense way, or have come to the fore during pandemic, because the pandemic was a situation which gave the government the opportunity of utilizing these and stimulating these feelings, which actually has given it more control, greater control, and in this way has actually eaten up on our anxiety and also on our collective trauma. These are the 2 points that actually have been made by, I think, Rakesh. And I would, if there is anything that I have missed out, probably both the speakers can add to it. Both the papers were extremely important and extremely insightful. And we thank both the speakers for reading such beautiful, insightful papers. Over to, yes. You want to say something, Adrienne? You
Yeah,
have
you
to
are muted. Yeah.
I wanted to thank the organization, the Psychoanalytic Society of India, for including me in this discussion. And I really felt lots of education for me in Rakesh's speech and the history, both in the current and the questions. So to me, this was very, also added a lot to my understanding and awareness at an international level. And I think we often get very located in our own pods. And this for me was an opportunity to listen and learn as well as communicate. And I'm just very grateful. Thank you.
Over to Bharti.
Well, before I thank you, I just want to make a small comment. Though we had so many common pointers and we were seeing at, the systemic change to make in lines of racism, in lines of abuse. But I was simply wondering about, the defense, the adaptive defenses and the pathological defenses, and even culture, even racism, even, the difference in different culture, different geographical races. These actually were adaptive responses or adaptive defenses for any community long time back. These were actually not fault lines, or they were not actually pathological. Each community or each group adapted according to their geographical areas or their groups, and they actually founded their cultural norms, and there was a heterogeneity. The more we started, this migration and this globalization and opening of country boundaries happening, these things somewhere, taken up instead of being adaptive, they started became, rigid or kind of pathological, because what was adaptive in one culture or one community or one geographical area was not really adaptive in somewhere else. But your identity required those defenses. You cannot adapt immediately to a new culture or to a new geographical areas. And somewhere this has, because we were talking about migrant laborers and the kind of migration happening just in this during this pandemic, almost similar to partition, I was just simply wondering about these things, because another thing that came to my mind associatively was, though we are talking about bringing in changes in this area of racism and these kind of pathological defenses, probably very soon we are going to fight between the person or the humans that we are and the machine that is there. We have already started, and the pandemic has given a very sharp rise from bringing us in person to online. Now this has again bring new challenges, because now not only democracy and legal system or analysis or other systems, but just, putting everything online will give control to those people, those very few people who would be handling things online, things digitally. So we are moving towards where, control are going to be in some people's hands. We have already seen those kind of times with, different dictators, and probably now we might see a new face of it. Today in the pandemic, in the lockdown, what was blessing for us, that we could connect. Even now we are feeling connected, we are feeling connected globally. We could have these webinars only because of this online system, this digital and technological advancement. So this today it seems like blessing, just like initially the cultural adaptation, the norms and the group formation was so just the way today we are wondering about bringing a change in this cultural norms and these defenses, what tomorrow brings, it's really a wonderment. So that's just something that I was wondering about.
So I
So
allow you to give the vote of thanks.
yes, yeah, with that, I would like to thank you, Adrienne. Thanks, Rakesh, for wonderful, wonderful papers. And thanks, thanks the audience that we have, the global audience and people from India. So we are together discussing different things, discussing all these things and looking at them analytically. Thanks to our backhand staff, backhand people who are doing this. Anoma is managing the whole digital platform. Devjani has created the different logos and all. And I would like to thank our president who at the last minute, agreed to chair. I'm very, very sorry. And we are unfortunate that Plinio Montaga, he could not chair the webinar because of some very sudden family emergencies. And thank you all. I hope we would meet again in our next webinar, as we are planning the series of webinars every month, at least one. And I hope to see you all again. With that, thank you very much.